Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Center Stage and the second panel on the Water and Business Program. The Water and Business Program is made possible in collaboration with the government of the Netherlands and Civi. Today's discussion is going to unpack the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. I say that every day. CSDDD. This has huge implications for business and the water community. There are costs for repatriation of action, there are costs for monitoring, and there's costs for reporting. This provides opportunity. This also provides challenges. To discuss this here with us today, I'm really happy to welcome on stage Julius Senin, Senior Policy Advisor, Government of the Netherlands, Jessica Trejo, Social Innovation Manager, Hasbro, Mark Fletcher, Global Water Business Leader, Arup, and joining us online, Kate Lamb, Freshwater Strategy Specialist, UNEP Finance Initiative. Okay. It's dramatic, but it's not that dramatic. We can change the sound.
Sounds like we're in a hangar.
Exactly. We do want to build momentum, but maybe this is overdoing it. But Kate, I want to come to you first. CSDDD is making mandatory what has been in the past voluntary for industry. Now, you've said in the past, you've been waiting a long time for this. It's now here. In your perspective, what was that aha moment to go from thought to action to now policy?
Thanks, Arati, and thank you for the team for facilitating my joining you. I've seen the screen, so I know how big my face is in that room, and I'm sorry that it's so intimidating. I'm really very nice in person. So you're right. We've been within the civil society community, within the business community, within the finance community, within the national government community. We've all been waiting for this intervention for the longest time. It was left in the doldrums of voluntary action for the last 20, 30 years, and rightly so. We've had this time to learn the lessons, to understand what has worked and what hasn't worked, to understand how significant turning these rather large corporations around, how much time that takes. But the aha moment for me came, I think, when Mark Carney stood up and made his Tragedy of the Horizon speech. This was in 2015, where central bankers fundamentally started to make the link between a worsening climate and financial stability. It also made the link between a rapid transition to a net zero future and, again, the implications of that being rapid and unfortunately mismanaged, and the implication for financial stability again. That was a moment when the central bankers all around the world stood up and realized that this was no longer a topic that could be left in the voluntary world, that it was no longer just a nice to have, an aspect of CSR and doing business because it was the right thing to do. This was a financial stability threat that would weaken economies worldwide. And from there, we've seen now a large number of central banks come together under the guise of the NGFS, another acronym, the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a coalition of the willing. There's over 140 central banks from all around the world working together to help develop standards, guidance, and methodologies for finance institutions, and in turn, the corporations and businesses that they invest in, to better manage this transition to a world in which people and places are prioritized above profit, so that we all benefit and have economies that work for all of us.
Thanks, Kate. And I think you say something, and Julius is actually nodding his head, and he's next. So I think there's going to be a nice segue here. You talk about, of course, having left it in the doldrums for a long time, but it's the central banks that took the initiative to actually make this happen. So as much as you're putting people before profit, there is a quantification element that has led us to get to where we are. Mm-hmm. And then, Julius, it takes us to you, because there is conversation now about creating a level playing field. You have these regulations to allow not just the front runners, but the laggards, if you like, to actually catch up, to actually meet the requirements that now everyone has to take forward. How do you see this directive being crucial to actually allow industry to come together?
Thank you, Arati, and also thank you to SIWI and all the organizers for placing responsible business conduct, and in this case, CSDDD center stage. I think it's a very important discussion to have. From my experience, what we have seen over the past few years, working on responsible business conduct in the Netherlands over the past few years, based on these voluntary measures that were created of the banks, but also moving forward with our sectors, we have seen that the uptake, although positive, it has been lacking behind. Some companies were taking them on, and many others weren't, either because they didn't have to, or because it was too complicated for them to really get into their supply chains and understand where the risks were, this risk-based approach. And I'm very happy that the CSDDD takes the lessons that we have seen over the past years, aligns them with the OECD and UN international standards on business, and takes these a step further and mandates that businesses in Europe, or businesses that are doing business within Europe, take these base guidelines to their core business and start working on them. And the idea is that this regulation and many others, which I maybe come to later as well, is that it indeed raises the bar for all involved, but at the same time also mandates that we are going to really look at what are the adverse impacts, because those are the ones that we need to show and, based on a risk, avoid. And if the bad deed has been done, how are we going to mitigate the negative impacts? And I think this is really pushing the envelope, and what we haven't seen yet, and this helps us in discussion with business to promote this responsible business conduct.
The audience can't see it, but Jessica's raising her eyebrows. I love it because every facial recognition allows me to move to the next speaker. And Julius, of course, is government, and we have Kate, who's pushing it from a non-profit background, to say we bring collective action together. Now, Jessica, your industry, you are the recipient of this information. You are the recipient not only of CSDDD, but CSRD. It's all come in a very short span of time. It all requires you to pivot. Maybe not pivot so much in the case of Hasbro, but it requires you to do accountability monitoring, responsibility monitoring, directives, look into your supply chains. It's a lot of work in a short time. What are your reactions to regulations?
Well, thank you, Rati. I want to start by saying we understand the why. So this is clear. We're not fighting against it. I think the question here is the how. Because if we look at it from the overall, the superficial level, yes, it all makes sense. But when you break it down into what do I actually have to do and how do I do it, that's really where we see the big split. And it's not just one regulation. It's fantastic, but the challenge is everything is coming together. So you go from zero to hero in a very short time. And I have to say, corporations like mine or bigger corporations, we are looking at this or complaining from a luxurious position because we have the access to consultants. But when they are also lost, when they also say, okay, this is overwhelming because there is a lot of room for interpretation, which, yes, you can also understand as flexibility, but when the room is so big, you just get lost. And there is nobody really that you can discuss with. So what does that concretely mean? So it's rather all coming together, and at the same time, it's understanding that we also have organizational constraints, like any other sector or any other industry. Luckily, we have very committed, very knowledgeable teams, but they're also very small. So just suddenly putting all this pressure on it, it means we have limited resources, and you have to prioritize. And unfortunately, it gets to the point where you have to decide, or you would focus more on, okay, I need to get this regulation because otherwise there is a consequence. And in my case, I'm very fortunate to say we never did it for the carrot or the stick. We did it because of intrinsic motivation. But once you have to then fulfill a template, otherwise there is a complication, and there is not even clarity on it, then it gets very tricky. I'm afraid that the impact that we're looking into, it's rather going to become just a bureaucratic process.
And that's what we need to discuss here, because we need to understand how we make the how easier. And of course, there is time before these get regulated and enforced, and there is time to have these discussions. Say, how do we help you? How do we create best practice? And Mark, I'm coming to you because you're no stranger to World Water Week, and what you bring with you every time we get you on center stage is examples of best practice, of how we can move forward, how we can take some of the difficulties that Jessica's raising. And again, you have the access to resources, not everyone does. And there's a resource question here to actually make this shift possible. What case studies do you have?
Well, I'd like to see, or for us all to think about this as an opportunity. It's an opportunity. At the moment, we're going to have to try things in practice, but what we're really about is trying to embed more sustainability in business. And to complement what we're doing, I'd like to give an example of maybe what DC Water have done in the water space. They restructured their whole corporate strategy around the UN SDGs to embed sustainability at the heart of what they did. They then looked at looked at their whole supply area and considered themselves, how do we put resilience at the heart of what we're doing? We're basically a city and our outliers. How can we look at that and embed that? They used world-leading best practice. And then they produced their ESG report, the first for a water company in the US, and then shared that widely. So I think that's a little bit like we're the enlightened few. We want to share what we're doing as best practice, and then we want to cast a pebble out and hope that it'll ripple back, people saying, well, actually, if you embed sustainability at the heart of what you do, it's really good for business, and it's good for society, and it's good for nature, which we'd all agree with. So I'd see that it's complementary to what we're talking about here. None of these things on their own are going to get us to where we want to get to, and there's going to be, I think you mentioned the word laggards. The enlightened few maybe you'll get some momentum behind what we're doing, and I think these regulations will help that as well. But then we're still going to have laggards, or where it's difficult, and the best way to do that is to share best practice, what works, but also what doesn't work and what's quite difficult and what's not working at the moment, so that we get to be a bit more practical in the way we look at implementation.
Jessica?
Just a comment, because there are companies, again, I'm going to put the example of my company, in which sustainability is already part. It's not new. We are already doing this for many, many years. So it's not that you're going to get sustainability through the reportings. It's actually, I have to say, this is kind of deviating us from really, if you have to allocate the resources, then unfortunately, that is going to take away some of the resources of what you were already doing per se, and it's not necessarily that a reporting and a bureaucratic process is going to take you to sustainability.
So,
Mark, before I come to you, I'm just going to come to Kate.
Of course.
And then I'm going to come back to you, because Kate, you're hearing what's happening on stage and on the discussion. And that's part of what we need to be doing in terms of taking forward how we work together. There will be teething troubles. And of course, UNEP, CDP before that, are toolboxes and resources to be utilized. And we haven't touched upon the finance sector yet. We haven't touched upon the FIs and where they come into this discussion, because of course that is a critical credibility factor, an incentive builder to actually push the conversation in a certain direction. So what are the teething troubles that you foresee, and specifically from finance, from FIs and what they can do? How can they get involved in helping us build some bridges?
So the FIs are going to be, are one of the major beneficiaries of the data that emerges from these processes, but also of the more sustainable, more secure businesses that will result, right? Because let's face it, the cost of inaction on this topic is far greater than the cost to act. And yes, we will have to make some trade-offs internally within firms at this minute, because most of the departments that are responsible or have been responsible for sustainability and reporting in corporations are micro relative to the size of the change that is required. Corporate social responsibility teams are expected to not only be amazing at sustainability and implementing projects, but they're supposed to be experts in procurement, in risk management, in legal, and filling in really good but complicated and comprehensive spreadsheets. That would not happen for financial management within an organization. You have very specific skills in very specific places. So those companies that are going to win on this topic understand that and don't expect the CSR department only to be the ones to deliver and forge ahead with this change, but it is built into the DNA of the companies at every single level, the way in which the company is structured, its governance mechanisms, its indicators for success, the reasons why people get bonuses or don't get bonuses, the skills that they're deploying across every single department will have some aspect of CSDDD, CSRD, and sustainability in their business descriptions and in their JDs. And if they don't, then we're going to continue with embattled CSR departments that are struggling and feeling like they've got to make this trade-off. But it is a false trade-off, and the business will fail to seize the opportunities as a result. And those opportunities from the FI side of things, from banks, from insurance companies, from institutional investors, from credit rating agencies, from stock exchanges, are huge. Whether that is higher, a better cost of capital, so lower costs of capital, it costs you less to get a loan, you're more likely to get that relationship with an insurer, you're more likely to have your credit rating rated higher and therefore more attractive when you want to issue a bond or you want to do another project. When you want to take on more suppliers, because let's face it, there are going to be fewer suppliers that are going to be able to meet all of your needs for the short term. So those suppliers will have a choice as to who they're going to sell to, and they will want to sell to companies that are also aligned with what they're trying to achieve and are there as partners supporting them in doing taking the necessary steps. So have the FIs got all of their stuff together? Do they know, and have they mapped this landscape essentially, and have they got their systems in place in order to be able to interpret the data in meaningful and in the right ways? Not everyone, but they are miles ahead of where most people think they are already. And they're making decisions based at the moment on modeled data, because information of this level just doesn't exist. It's not emerging from companies. Hence, again, why the legislation has existed, because if I was in a company, I would want to make sure that that FI was making a decision based on data that I've given them, rather than data that has been made up by some artificial intelligence algorithm, right? So the opportunities there are great. The markets are ready and are chomping at the bit to get their hands on this information. And I think it is inevitable that we are going to be feeling some pain in the short term with regards to these pieces of legislation. But when one considers the cost of missing these opportunities and failing to address worsening water insecurity and the climate crisis and the destruction of nature, and all of the list is endless, it doesn't bear thinking about what that means for our economies versus the short-term pain that we're going to have to go through to restructure our departments and our processes and procedures in order to deliver what we want and need.
Mark, you had a comment.
I actually think you're probably one of the enlightened few, because across the water sector, I think there's still some way to go, particularly in the US. But just to pick on something that Kate's just said, I also I chair British Water, I represent the supply chain. And I think this should be a really great opportunity for those enlightened suppliers who bring goods and services. And it just feels like maybe we need, you could help the supply chain by translating something like this as sort of, what does this mean for dummies? I'm not insulting people's intelligence, but something that's quite practical that allows people to then engage and make sure that we've then got a supply chain that's providing towards a need as this starts to practically be implemented.
So Jessica, I'm going to come to you next. So when Kate talked about, from her perspective, the teething troubles, there's also a huge benefit in terms of understanding the cost of inaction, the incentives for financial institutions to be able to work with the data. Now, she said the data that you generate as the data that's generated for you. At the same time, from an industry perspective, and from what Mark is saying in terms of, do we need a dummies guide? Does regulation, in your opinion, speak the language of business?
From my opinion, no. Because yes, again, I go back to my first point. We understand the why. And I don't think that, doing it because of financial benefits, because being very honest, what kind of companies are they going to benefit from these financial benefits? Because these regulations, they actually have an impact and influence on a very large number of companies. And we're not talking only about the big ones that need all of these financial instruments. There are also smaller ones. And I do think that it is very clear. I mean, no company in their right mind would actually want to go intentionally against human rights or want to go for a supplier that is not actually, that is something going to backlash to your reputation. However, we also need to understand that this is it's a more complex topic, because there are also suppliers and more suppliers that are not within the AU. So this is going to have also an impact. And if I have the upper hand with my suppliers, yes, I can find a way. But if I don't, and I lose the supplier, and I lose my competitive advantage, or I even lose my business, that's going to have a repercussion also in my local economy. And also to understand that there is a missing link as well of us as consumers, because there's also at the same time this trend of asking for faster and cheaper products, yet we are being constrained, and it's a whole circle. So I think it's about, and also one point about the timing. Yes, CSRD, there are a few years to get to that, but it's so complex. It's really such a big topic that you need to start working on it today. But you don't have the time and the resources or even the clarity. So yes, please do give me a dummy's guide.
Yeah.
But I think it's rather understand that I'm not trying to get away from it. I do genuinely understand the impacts of it. But let's work together on how to reach the impact we want to reach, and not just how do I fill out a template.
Julius, that's directed at you.
Yeah, no, completely.
Regulation is just not one step. There needs to be socialization of this.
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah, and I can really relate to this point that you're making. And for me to be having a discussion like this, also in the Netherlands, to already have, we need things, to be able to have a conversation about what is needed is already a step forward for many of what we have seen in the past. And I think when you said, is the regulation speaking enough to what we need from business? No, of course not, because it's a piece of regulation. It doesn't stipulate what needs to happen. I think it is merely a means to an end of a wider discussion of promoting responsible business conduct and all the facets that belong to that. And I think as governments, we have not only the tool of regulation, of saying, well, you have to meet these standards now, but we need to work with our sectors, we need to work with other stakeholders, not only on a national level, but also international level. We have to inform them, we have to work together with them on promoting certain standards, sector standards. We have to work with sector overarching sector organizations, if you will, to promote these kind of standards. And then this becomes a collaborative process of understanding what it is. And I think there is the important role for government to play and to take if we're going to meet this. If we want really sustainability, we cannot just hang back and say, well, good luck businesses, because indeed there is also the economic aspect, which is for a company important, but as Kate referred to, we are doing this because we see the cost of doing nothing is far much greater, and for this is an instrument to push the envelope and have this discussion with businesses. And now, to be honest, they have to come to our table. They cannot hide anymore, and that we have seen we need.
If you tell us where to find you, we will be there.
Kate, I'm going to come to you next. So you heard Jessica talk about, and Julius mentioned, of course, looking into your supply chains. Also, there's been discussion on the stage about how fair is this for industries of different sizes? Can we resource this shift? Can we actually get the experts, you touched upon it also, that are here in time to make us be relevant and have the reporting that we need? You have case studies of how to work with suppliers, how to actually come together and to offset size, if you like, where people who don't have access to Mark's Dummies Guide, which is coming out shortly, will understand from others and share experiences about what they can do with their supply chains and their suppliers.
Yeah, I mean, I think that aspect of demonstrating the art of the possible is essential in any process of change, right? We are, because let's not forget, this is a systemic change intervention that we're witnessing here, and that is going to be messy. Change is rarely linear. We will stumble along the way, but we will also succeed in taking strides forward. The fairness point I think that Jessica raised earlier it's a vital one, particularly for markets where this type of legislation doesn't exist at the moment, right? Across Asia Pac, across the US, across Latin America, the same level of expectation of corporations is not there yet. But that doesn't mean that we stop in the EU. What we ultimately also need to do is demonstrate that this level of ambition in the EU needs to be replicated elsewhere, and we need a level playing field globally in order for that fairness piece to be realized. In terms of the burden of executing on this type of regulation on business size, yes, there are risks there as well. You know, those companies that are well resourced are going to be able to implement this well. One of the biggest concerns is the cost of realizing this will be not realized by the corporations that can afford to pay, but will be realized and borne by the poor suppliers who are vulnerable and don't have the resources to implement the processes and procedures that are required to be able to meet the needs of larger corporations. So I'm less interested in a sense in helping companies like Jessica's, as wonderful as it is. She's already got it. She's in the room and she's working towards executing this within the firms. But it is the SMEs and the smaller suppliers that are going to require help and support. And that needs to be produced at a sectoral and a national level so that they are not left high and dry. Now, what does that mean? I think if you look at the world of carbon and climate writ large, the number of the bits of infrastructure that exist to ease decision making are coming out of our ears and our nostrils and every other bodily orifice you can wish to think of. We've got GHG protocols, we've got PCAF and PBAF in here, we've got data sets like you wouldn't believe it. We've got very, very sophisticated conversations happening within different business institutions that are moving the world of climate along. For water, we don't even have a standard on how to calculate the water footprint of a supply chain at this stage. We don't know what to say in terms of quality and how to quantify that in a meaningful way so that people can make decisions. We don't have those standards. But those in the room at the moment and those at the table on the stage, I think, have a huge role to play in filling those gaps so that we are not reinventing the wheel and every business is reinventing the wheel constantly. But we're all talking from the same language. But when we get it right, it works. And you look at Ørsted as an example. It was one of the world's largest and most dirtiest coal users. And it was producing around a third of Denmark's GHG emissions. It's completely transformed its business model, and it is now the largest, most successful green energy supplier. So transformation is possible.
I'm going to cut you off there because I think you're saying exactly what I want to ask the panel in closing, because what we're doing Water in Business is not just to have this discussion and then walk away from it. It's actually to raise the questions the water community here needs to listen to. What do you need to look out for? What do you need to be aware of? Of course, people in the room are here for a reason. Everyone online is here to also listen and learn. So there are teething troubles. There are short-term challenges. But if we understand what we're looking for, we can start understanding how to find solutions. I'm going to come to Julius actually first. In terms of, Kate touched upon, of course, carbon versus water, right, in terms of regulation. What do we need to be aware of these regulations in terms of what more needs to be done here to allow industry to actually start stepping in?
I think two things. First and foremost, I think talking to industry in the Netherlands, and particularly because I'm an agricultural expert, talking to the agricultural sector, is that reach out, come together. It's a first step. It's a multi-stakeholder process, and this regulation, whether it is trying and testing, it is coming. So first step is reach out. If there is processes as government you can support, governments also really take a role in this, particularly those in the EU. Your businesses need you. So those are the 2 points. I think one, to industry, really start reaching out, and for governments as well, take your role because your businesses need you in clarifying, but also in the harmonization. It's not only the CSDDD, it's many other regulations in the EU that all need to be harmonized. You don't want to go to different government offices and talk to a certain aspect. the RBC policy is meant as a overarching policy, and I think that is the discussion we ought to have in support.
Mark.
I wonder whether we should start to think about what destination we're heading for. Why are we doing this? How can we establish some common purpose? I like things like WWF have come up with a freshwater challenge. We want to get something that corporates can see what they could sort of contribute to in some way. It's the way in which you herd cats. You get a big juicy fish and you hold it out there. Everyone's got to see that there's some value in going in this direction, both for their business and for the wider society and environment. I think that's what's important to me.
Jessica, I give you the last words.
I think there is enough knowledge, their intention is there. We just need to put away the fear of losing face and the ego, and really being open about, we want to do this together. We're on the same side. We're not against you. Just help me get this done so we can both achieve the impact we want to make.
Right.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm hand of applause to our panelists for this Water and Business Summit. Join us tomorrow for the conclusion of these discussions.
Thank you.
Thanks all.